Okay.
Our recording's on and the share screen?
Not yet.
No, not yet. Okay.
Give me a minute. I will.
We are waiting with great geduld, if you know the word.
Share screen.
We are very geduldig.
Ja, geduldig.
Hello, hello, hello. Anybody hear me? No.
Robert,
Yeah.
Bethel, I can hear you.
Oh, good, good.
Good evening. What we are exercising now is geduld, if you know the word.
Geduld.
Patience.
סבלנות.
Savlanut. Patience, I assume, in French.
Mhm.
And
40% of the English words are of French
Wie
origin.
macht man das Share-Ding da schon wieder? Wie macht man das schon wieder mit dem? Ist das unter Host-Tools, unter Meeting-Einstellungen?
Was läuft dort nicht?
Jetzt warte mal.
Das ist Schweizerdeutsch.
Das
Das
is-
ist
das
Deutsch,
is
ja.
Schweizerdeutsch. Absolutely.
Okay. So geht das nicht. Jetzt sofort wieder. So 8 gut wird sein, gut. Ich bin dort. Aber ist das
Right,
unter,
good sounds good.
ist das unter Host-Tools gewesen? Wieso gesehen? Bildschirm freigeben. I did it. Now it should be.
Ah, thank you.
Yeah.
I dank. I großen Dank.
Schkeuer.
Here we are. Down.
Sorry.
Voilà, ça marche.
No worries. Always a pleasure. Thank you, Yael. So we're going to have a look at the Marshal on Kabbalistic practices. The one that he wrote about that's fairly well known is Sadichet 98. It's sitting whilst you put on your tefillin shel yad and standing whilst you put on your tefillin shel rosh. Now, Jo, I'm sure you've heard of that.
The Sephardim do that.
The Sephardim do it. Has anybody else seen Sephardim put on tefillin? They sit
I
down,
never saw
They
it.
sit. They sit.
they sit for the
They
shel
sit.
yad,
Sure. Sure.
and they stand for the shel rosh.
Yes.
So if you want to know why they do, we're going to find out this evening. We're also going to find out why the Marshal really lambasted, which is an English word that means strongly criticized, that practice, and why that he strongly criticized any practices that is found in the Zohar that doesn't have a strong base in Talmud and Poskim. And of course, it's important for me to say here and now that the great mitnagdim, the opponents of Chassidut, Marshal being number one, right through to the Gaon of Vilna and the other misnagdim, were not against Kabbalah in the sense that they did not learn Kabbalah. They did. One of the only books that the Gaon of Vilna published in his life was a commentary on the Sifra Ditzniuta, which is part of the Zohar. But they felt that the Zohar and Kabbalah was only for the rabbinical elite, and that what happened when common people like you and me get our hands on Kabbalah and Zohar, we misuse it, and as usual, we're superficial, and we don't really understand, and then we think that we're doing marvelous things, but in fact, we're probably doing the wrong thing, and therefore we should stay away. It's like dynamite. So you have to be a real expert before you can handle it. And with those few words of introduction, let's see if we can read some of the Marshal. Now, what I've done and what I'm probably going to do with Tshuvot is that since they're very dense, I'm going to give you a little introduction to each part of the Tshuva in English. Somebody can read. Then I will read the actual Hebrew of the Tshuva or the mixed Hebrew and Aramaic. And in some cases, we may get to Ladino and Yiddish too. And then we'll move on to the next bit. And then when I have something to say that takes us away from the text of the Tshuva, I'll give you the whole text and we'll see it as a supplemental text. So let's begin with English, So I will spare you, Jean, the English, and I see that Deborah Sinclair is on the screen, number 1. So Debbie, would you please read line 6? Maharshal.
Maharshal was asked about the newly introduced Kabbalistic practice into the Ashkenazi communities of Eastern Europe of sitting whilst putting on the Tefillin Shel Yad and standing whilst donning the Tefillin Shel Rosh.
Okay, so what we know about the Maharshal, who is 16th century, and what we're saying here is the newly introduced into Ashkenaz. Remember, the Zohar appears in the 13th century. The Ari is the 16th century. So Maharshal, 15th century. The Zohar starts out in Sfarad, and it definitely is accepted in the Islamic world. It takes a lot longer for it to get to the Ashkenazi world. And you can see that the Maharshal is a bit perturbed by the fact that this is rather new and he's not quite sure about it at all. Now, what does he actually say? Tshuva ahuvi yedidi hamaskil harav Mordechai bereb Tanchum yishmerehu tzuro. So this is a response to my beloved, my friend. Now, being called a maskil by the Maharshal was apparently okay. Okay, a couple of hundred years later, maskil is definitely not accepted
Negative.
in Orthodoxy at all. Okay, you're a maskil, you are not davening mincha, and you're reading books like the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim and going off into languages, philosophy, and science. But in the 16th century, it was 16th century, it was still okay. כששאלת אותי על מנהגי, אם להניח תפילין של יד בישיבה או בעמידה. So the question is, what does the Maharshal do? Does he put on tefillin shel yad sitting down and then standing up? Or does he stand up for both? מפני שראית הרבה מן המדקדק עניות להניח תפילין של יד בישיבה. Because you have seen amongst those who are particular, ledaktek, or who infer, and then he uses a phrase, bedikduk ani. Does anybody have any idea what this means? You'll be forgiven if you don't. This is the peril and the excitement of reading a tshuva, is that a great Meshiv like the Maharshal expects the correspondent to know everything there is to know. Entire Shas, Poskim, and everything else. So if you don't, you have to do a bit of searching. But in fact, this is a sharp retort by the Maharshal. The phrase Dikduk Aniyut occurs in the second parak of Masechet Eruvin. So it's Daf Mem Aleph Amud Bet, and the Gemara, the Mishnah talks about non-Jews who move your Eruv on a Shabbat. Naturally, you're a bit caught because when the non-Jews kick around your Eruv, you might not be able to carry anything or travel, and you'll be in trouble. Then the Gemara says there are Shosha Dvarim Ma'avirin Adam al Da'ato Al Da'at Kono. 3 things can make you lose your mind, get absolutely panic-stricken, and they can also make you disobey halacha. What are they? They are akum, non-Jews. And again, not deliberately, but I'm just thinking of the fact that this is purely personal. In the army many years ago, we spent a lot of time building an Eruv in the the place where we were in a country in the Middle East. And we really invested. And some secular soldiers purely innocently just drove their armored vehicle straight through the Eruv, and we were stuck. Okay? So this is what happens. Non-Jews can affect Jewish life in such a way that you've got absolutely no choice, and you may even need to work on Shabbat. That's something that the Gemara does say. Correct, Jean? That now the second one is ruach ra'ah. You become depressed, psychologically moody, then you can also lose your bearings and become a sinner. The final one is dikdukei aniyut, which means the pressures of poverty. but it's become a phrase in rabbinic Hebrew and in modern Hebrew for those who are very sophisticated when you are getting very finicky about petty matters. In other words, you start analyzing and thinking, but the thing that thinking about is really not important. It's very vain. It means nothing at all. So that's why the Marshal puts in the Gershayim between the Vav and the Kuf. So unless you knew the Gemara and you knew the use of that expression, Dikduk Aniyut, means that those people who ask that his questioner is a medakdek aniyut. He's asking a sophisticated, hair-splitting question about something which is really not important at all, or might even be very negative. La'aniach tefillin shel yad b'yeshiva. You've just seen a lot of people doing it. It's a new fashion, and fashions catch on. So you want to know from me. The next read I see on my screen is Alan Liebler. Alan, you are not muted, so would you like to read line 12? Just 2 lines.
You hear me?
Yes, sure.
He begins by criticizing those who lack a deep understanding of the Zohar and simply copy things they have read in it.
Okay, now I'll give you what he actually says in Hebrew. De'u ahuvi, no, my dear friend. Chadashimi karov bau. You remember that pasuk from Dvarim? Okay, lo sha'arum avotechem. Newfangled beliefs come from here and there. They're close to us, but really they're far away. And they are idolatry. Everybody wants to be a makubal. And he plays upon the fact that one of the books of the Zohar is called Midrash HaNe'elam. He wants to say it's Ne'elam to you. You people that have no idea what you're actually reading and doing. Okay, these are talumot. These are hidden riddles. But here you go around wearing the garb, walking the walk, okay, talking the talk, and you're actually far away from anything that's really worthwhile. And since you are ne'elam, then you can't see very far either. Lo yabitu ba'or hazohar. You cannot really understand, and you don't comprehend the light of the Zohar, which is, of course, Zohar means bright light. The lo yayedu motzao umevo'o. You don't know where the Zohar begins. You don't know where the Zohar ends. You have no idea what the Zohar really means. But you found a line in the books of the Rashbi, and then you get very excited and you start doing it. Well, that's not the thing to do at all. So you can already figure what Rashbi is going to say. Okay, Avi, you're on next. Can you unmute and give us the next line, please? Avi? Can you unmute, please? Unmute.
Okay.
Okay, line 16, the introduction to the next bit.
Yeah, he points out that this is not authentic halachic practice as determined by the Talmud and the Poskim. And even if Reb Shimon ben Yochai was to appear in person and argue that a long-standing Talmud-based practice ought to be changed, we would pay no attention to him.
Now, this, of course, is a major plank in what we might call the Lithuanian Misnagdish approach to all mysticism. Ignore it unless it has a strong basis in the Talmud. And here, the Marshal is as sharp as he always is. Say it really was Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai who wrote the Zohar, and we have cast doubts about that. Say he was to come and appear for us today and say, this is what God wants. This is what you should be doing. We, the Marshal and his ilk, and the Gaon of Vilna would say, sorry, go home. We're not listening to you, okay? In general,
the halakha does not follow the Zohar, and an apt illustration is that notwithstanding the Zoharic statement that one who wears tefillin on Chol HaMoed is liable to the death penalty, we both don them on Chol HaMoed and make the requisite blessing.
Okay, so the Marshal begins by saying, well, you know, there's a much more widely known prescription of the Zohar, which is that you may not, under any circumstances, put on tefillin on Chol HaMoed if you do your chayav mitah. And yet the Marshal says, speaking in 16th century, Ostrava and Brisk and Lublin, we're all laying out tefillin on Chol HaMoed, as many of us Ashkenazim remember from our youths. I didn't say misbegotten youths, I just said from our youths. Okay, so what does he actually say? V'da ahuvi. And know, my dear friend, shekol rabotai v'avotai kadoshim, all my teachers and holy ancestors who gave up their lives in the Crusades rather than become Catholics, sheshimshu gaonei olam, and they served the gaonim of the world. Ra'iti mehem shelo nagu kach ela kedivrei Talmud v'aposkim. Nobody ever did anything other than the Talmud and the Poskim, and they all laid their tefillin on Chol HaMoed. ואם היה רשב"י עומד לפנינו וצווח לשנות המנהג שנהגו הקדמונים, לא אשכחינן בי, כי ברוב דבריו אין הלכה. And now he says that actually most times what's written in the Zohar is not genuine halakha. וראיה לזה שהוא כתב סודות גדולות ועשרות נפלאות. He wrote great secrets and wondrous wonders. שהמניח תפילין בכל המועד חייב מיתה. If you put your tefillin b'chol HaMoed, you're liable to death penalty. And we both put on and we bless. Now, the Zohar actually says the following in Midrash HaNe'elam, Shir HaShirim. And this I will do. Va'asir le'abara tfilin demare alma ula'anachat tfilin akareinin de'imnun dugma u'diokna letata. It would be a terrible thing if we took off the tefillin of the master of the universe and put on our poor artificial tefillin, humanly made. Malka dabai lenatra lavde. Now there's a parable. A king wants to protect his servant. Amarle, he says to him, Avid diokna de chotama dili. Make an image of my seal. Kol zimna dahu diokna yitchaze alach. As long as you are carrying that image of my seal with you, the whole world will be terrified of you. You're protected by my seal. Later, because of his friendship, the karachim alei malka that the king had for his friend, he actually gives him the original seal, okay? The one which is on high, the celestial seal. Once this servant of the king gets the real thing, then he throws aside the artificial one, the human one that he made. But should the servant choose to cast aside the actual real seal of God and maintain his artificial, his made seal, that slave to be put to death. And that's the source of this line that the Zohar prescribes a death penalty if anybody wears Chol HaMoed on tefillin on Chol HaMoed. Since he's clearly holding the seal of God in disrespect. And therefore we do not put on our tefillin, which is a weak sign of God protecting us, when we are in God's strong presence, Shabbat, Yom Tov, and Chol HaMoed. So this is the source, okay? And the Zohar is very strong about this idea that if you wear an ot, then you don't need another ot. If you have God's personal ot, sign of your special status, don't put in a weaker sign. Now that idea is not, of course, unique to the Zohar. It's in the Gemara, but it's never expressed in that sense. And in the Gemara, it's not clear whether Chol HaMoed is like Shabbat and Yom Tov. And that, in fact, is the point. Thank you, Avi. Brian, could you please read line 1 on the second page? Maharshal points out that in Eretz Yisrael, tefillin are not worn on Chol HaMoed, but the reason is not the Zohar,
but the fact that the Rashba and other Rishonim resolved the inconclusive Talmudic discussion on this matter in favor of the view that tefillin are not worn.
In other words, in the 16th century, it was well known that in Eretz Israel, tefillin were not worn on Chol HaMoed. But the reason, says the Marshal, is a halakhic reason. All depends upon the interpretation of a sugya in the Gemara. ואף שבן ארץ ישראל אינם מניחים תפילין כלל בחול המועד, לפי שהרשב"א בא וביטל המנהג לפי סברתו שתפס דעת ריבן התוספות ולא שחשו לבד לדברי הזוהר. It's not the Zohar. You got it wrong. It is the Tosfos. And that's why they don't lay tefillin in Eretz Israel. Now, the Zohar comes in, and people often think it is only the Zohar, but there's a history here. Now, this is one of the sidebars, so I'm going to do the sidebar. Line 7, Va'atanya. This is the Gemara in Eruvin. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Yachol yaniach adam tefillin b'shabbatot v'yamim tovim, Talmud lomar v'rachal ot al yadcha. Mitzrechinot, yatzu ele shehen gufan ot. You need the ot on your hand when you are not immersed in an ot. Shabbat is ot hi beini uveinechem. Yom Tov is compared to Shabbat. We are much on a high level of Kedusha on Shabbat and Yom Tov. We don't need that symbol of Kedusha at a much lower level called tefillin or tzitzit on Shabbat and Yom Tov. And we do not lay tefillin on Shabbat and Yom Tov anywhere in the Jewish world, okay? But Rashi is clearly in favor of wearing tefillin on the Chol HaMoed. Why? Because in his commentary, what does he say? Mi shetzrichinot, yamim ish Yisrael tzrichin la'amid ot al atzman, la'akir she'em machzikim b'torato shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, yatzu shabbatot v'yamim tovim shel atzmanot, ben HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'Yisrael dichtiv, ki ot hi beini uveinechem. Rashi says shabbatot v'yamim tovim. Look at line 11. The Or Zarua, cites Rabbeinu Eliakim. Rabbeinu Eliakim was actually if you like, a Talmid Chaver of Rashi. He lived at the same time, 1030 until 1100, and he was part of a circle called Chachmei Magensa. I could talk about them for half an hour, so I'm not. But they were direct students of Rabbeinu Gershom Aragola, and they wrote commentaries on the Talmud, and Rashi basically wrote a much better version of the commentaries that had been written by the Chachmei Magensa, Mainz. And of course, Rabbeinu Eliakim eventually became the Rav and Rosh Yeshiva of Speyer. Most of his commentaries have been lost to us, where we have an entire commentary on Masechet Yoma, which is very interesting. But what does he say? He says, Shehen gufan ot shenahar sambatyon bochiach shenachim bahem. What is the sambatyon?
It's the river which only flows on Shabbos.
The miraculous river?
The river, exactly. The river is only passable on Shabbos, Shmuley. There are 6 days a week it throws up rocks and you can't cross it. On Shabbat, it calms down. You could cross the river. But on Shabbat, are Jews allowed to cross the river? No, they're not. So the 10 lost tribes are behind the river Sambatyon. It's a fascinating legend. Again, we could talk about that. The famous David Reuveni, who claimed to be a Messiah and almost got an interview with the Pope, okay, used this Sambatyon as a ploy to say that I will get the Jews out of the Sambatyon, and then they will join up with the Christians and will throw the Muslims out of the Holy Land. Okay, geopolitics is geopolitics, past, present, and future. But that's the Sambatyon. The Christians, of course, say that behind or beyond the Sambatyon is the land of Prester John. You may recall Prester John, but if not, look him up on the Wikipedia. We're going to move on. So let's have a look at the Tosfos. ולכאורה אין להניח תפילין בכל המועד שאין צריך אות דאסור במלאכה בדבר שאינו עבד. תוספות say, look, כל המועד, actually, you are forbidden to work. Only we have a lot of exceptions. For example, something that if you don't do it now is going to cause you loss or ruin, then you can do it on Chol HaMoed. And then there's Simchat Yom Tov, and there is a whole lot of other things prepared for guests, and we generally get around Chol HaMoed fairly easily, but some people are very makpid. They won't write, for example, on Chol HaMoed. And you have kedusha. Chol HaMoed Sukkot you need to eat in a sukkah, and on Pesach you must eat chametz. V'kach nifsak b'halachot gedolot. Sorry about the dyslexia. In halachot gedolot, if from the Gaonic period, okay, there is a psak that we do not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. So it's not the Zohar. The idea of not wearing tefillin on Chol HaMoed has a long halachic pedigree. And if we read the Rashba, we see it. Line 14. Ulinan halakat tefillin b'chol shel moed shesh'alta ma dati. Now, Rashba lived in Spain, but the Rosh came to Spain, and he brought with him the minhag of his Rebbe, the Maram of Rottenburg, to wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. And a lot of Ashkenazim came with the Rosh, so they end up in Toledo, which has always been not wearing tefillin. And so they asked the Rashba, who was the Spanish authority, what's going on here, okay? And so the Rashba says, look, Anis sover she'en manichin shegam hem ot. I hold with this idea that it's an ot. Sharei cholo shel moed asur b'chol melacha she'ena melechet ha'aved u'melacha doraita hi b'moed kulu tanai maitula mikra b'chagiga. And there is a machloket, but there is a powerful view that the Yisur melacha on chol moed is midoraita. V'chen mochiach gam ken b'shilhei shma tadaber kama d'avodah zara. There's a discussion whether you can actually write tefillin on Chol HaMoed, because if you can't write, how can you write tefillin unless you need to wear them on Chol HaMoed? But then the answer is it is davar ha'aved, and you can write tefillin on Chol HaMoed for after Chol HaMoed. Dat Raboteinu Balei HaTosafot v'chen dat ha'Raavad zal. Al pi in Provence, the Raavad writes, She'etiru lichtov otam la'atzmo b'chol shel moed v'chen anu nohagin. This is our minhag, and you can write tefillin on Chol HaMoed, because according to the Sephardi view, the Gaonic view, it is something that you do not wear on Chol HaMoed, but it is davar ha'aved, so you could in fact write it. That's the one fly in the ointment there. Number 18, Utfilin ani maniach b'chol HaMoed bivracha. Okay, let's see. Jean, I'm going to get you to change me. Would you like to read from line 18, Jean?
18.
Yeah.
וכן דעת רבותינו בעלי התוספות, וכן דעת הרב"ט ז"ל, אף על פי שהתירו לכתוב אותם לעצמו בחולו של מועד, וכן אנו נהגים.
That's Rashba. Now, can you give us the Rosh? ותפילין אני מניח.
ותפילין אני מניח בחול המועד בברכה, והספק שנסתפקו בו התוספות, אינו נראה בעיניי.
Now it says something fascinating in the tshuva. Read, וכתב תשובה.
וכתב תשובה על שאלה בחול המועד, מפני שהיה השליח ממתין לה, והתיר אף להעתיקה.
So here, this tshuva is very short. It was written by the Rosh's own admission to somebody who asked him. He said, I need the answer now. It's Chol HaMoed. So he couldn't give him a whole long speech, a whole long tshuva. So he says, and you know what? I'm writing on Chol HaMoed because I feel that you really need this. I need to write this psak. So from here we see that all of the mlachot on Chol HaMoed, there's quite a bit of flexibility. It's just interesting to see this. And could we give a zayin to Jean? Yesh mistapkin.
No, that means that normally Rosh was not writing on Chol HaMoed.
No, normally not. Okay?
יש מסתפקין ואדוני אבי הראש היה מניחן ומברך עליהן.
Now the two, Rabbi Yaakov, the son of the Rosh, is very clear. My father, the Rosh, would both put on tefillin Chol HaMoed and make the brachot. But there's a lot of differentiation in practice here. So let's have a look. Chet, Varashba katav b'tshuva. Now we're reading from the Bet Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, who was a Mukubal, a Kabbalist, and he is of course 16th century, died in 1575, and he would be Kabbalistically motivated. רשב"א כתב בתשובה שאין
חלק,
מניחים בכל המועד. וכן דעת
חלק א' סימן תר"ס ובמיוחסות לרמב"ן סימך רל"ז, שאין
Okay.
מניחים תפילין בחול המועד, וכן דעת התוספות והרב"ט ז"ל, וכן אנו נוהגים עד כאן לשונו. ועכשיו נהגו כל בני ספרד שלא להניחם בחול המועד, ושמעתי...
Just a second. Rabbi Karo is very clear. No Sfaradim are going to put on tefillin on Chol HaMoed, okay?
ושמעתי שמקודם היו מניחים אותן בחול המועד כדברי הראש.
Now the Rosh, as I said, came from Ashkenaz to Sfarad. Remember, his student of the Maharam was caught, he was kidnapped, held hostage, and Maharam refused to pay the ransom. He spent the last 12 years of his life incarcerated. But his Talmud, the Rosh, was able to leave Ashkenaz and get to Spain. And he influenced the Spaniards to start putting on tefillin. Okay? Now, so Rabbi Karo, of course, who's a Kabbalist, said there was a period in Sfarad when they did wear tefillin. So you see, these things are very, very fluid. Because the Rosh, great Rosh, came to Spain and said, you've got to put on tefillin. But now, ואחר כך
מצאו שכתב רבי שמעון בן יוחאי במאמר אחד שאסור להניחם בחול המועד.
But then we found the Zohar and Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, and now we've left the Rosh completely, and none of us would dare to put on tefillin on Chol HaMoed. ועל כן,
נמנעו מלהניחם בחול המועד, וכן כתב מורי דודי הרב יצחק קארו בתשובה.
Okay, and his uncle, who looked after him when he was in the Balkans, okay, he also says that because of the Zohar, we definitely reject the Rosh and we do not lay tefillin. But he says this was probably the ancient practice in Sfarad. ומאחר שבתלמוד הדידן
לא נתבהר דין זה בפירוש, מי יערף ליבו לגשת לעבור בקום עשה על דברי רבי שמעון בן יוחאי, המפליג כל כך באיסור הנחתן.
And now we hear the Kabbalist speaking. This is Rabbi Yosef Karo, lawyer and mystic, okay? Mishpatan umekubal. He says,
surprising that
John, I need to make this clear in English. He says that the din is not clear. We have a machloket in the Gemara as to whether Chol HaMoed is included in Ot, and therefore we should not be wearing tefillin. And now we have the Zohar. He says, who would dare deny what the Zohar says when there's an open debate in the Talmud? Okay, and this is Rabbi Yosef Karo's principle in the Shulchan Aruch. If it's debated in the Talmud, or there's no clear conclusion in the Talmud, and there's a Zohar or there's a Kabbalah, then do the Kabbalah and the Zohar. He uses the phrase kum va'aseh, which is in the Talmud in Yavamot, relation to mitzvot from the Torah. Who would possibly even conceive of breaking a biblical negative commandment? Well, he treats the Zohar in the same way, especially since the Zohar emphasizes the fact that if you would put on tefillin on Chol HaMoed, you would be liable to the death penalty. So it's real tough stuff. Okay, thank you, Jean. I will finish this off, although...
I wanted to say that it's surprising that they don't mention the Rambam, whose silence seems to say that he would put the tefillin.
The Rambam's silence is silence. There are things that the Rambam doesn't paskin, and it could go either way. Either it could have been so clear to him that you don't, okay, or, because remember, he died before the Rosh. So it could have been the minhag of the Gaonim and Sfarad, and he didn't think it was even worthwhile talking about. ובכל המועד גם כן אסור להניח תפילין מטעם זה בעצמו. This is in the Shulchan Aruch. שימי חול המועד גם הם אות. The Ramah, on line 28, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, Krakow, okay, brings Ashkenazi practice. ויש אומרים שחול המועד חייב בתפילין. וכן נוהגים בכל גלילות אלו. In all of our regions, in Ashkenaz, Poland, Germany, Russia, Lithuania, Lanicham, we put on tefillin and we make the bracha. אלא שאין מברכין עליהם בקול רם בבית הכנסת כמו שאר ימות השנה. But we might not make them as loudly as we do. So, so here we're already getting into some of the niceties here, but let's see. Michael Rosenfeld, are you comfortable reading in English? I've forgotten. But you have to unmute. Unmute.
Having sharply critiqued the emerging tendency to rely on the Zohar in order to change a long-standing halachic practice, Maharshal proceeds to deal with the question he was asked about sitting down whilst putting on Shel Yad, which is attributed to the Zohar.
In other words, he's made a good case for saying we don't accept the Zohar unless we have a good Talmudic and halachic basis for so doing, and we definitely don't take it as seriously as Rabbi Karo did. Now it is mentioned
as a Zoharic doctrine by Rav Yaakov Landau in his Sefer HaAgur, which
published
at
in
the time was an important source of Ashkenazi halacha. However, other than in the Agur, there is no reference to this practice in any halachic work whatsoever, and Rav Landau himself admits as much. Moreover, it is not mentioned in the Bavli, the Yerushalmi, Midrash Halacha, Psikta, or the She'elot. Nor did Rav Karo include this practice in Shulchan Aruch.
So there we are. That's a death sentence if there was one. So why are they doing it? All right. Now the Sefer Agur, Rabbi Yaakov Landau, just to fill this in, he was a rabbi in Landau, as Rabbi Yaakov Emden was a rabbi in Emden. But he moved from Ashkenaz to northern Italy. He was in Pavia and Napoli. Naples had a good printing press, Jewish printing press, and he became the copy editor of Jewish books. But he wrote the Sefer HaAgur, which actually gathered a lot of Ashkenazi and French Piskei Halacha, Mordechai Smak, Marivail, Maharil, Rabbi Yisrael, Isaline, the Baal Trumat Hadeshen, and the Ramah relies upon it. Why is it called Sefer HaAgur? Can anybody figure out on the basis of what I've just said?
The Agur is to collect things.
Thank you, Debbie. Exactly. He says
in Mishle you have the verb Agur.
Agur, he collected all of these opinions. The other reason, of course, he gives two. He also says that Agur could mean to be afraid. Ki yagorti. He says, I'm very modest. I was, very modest. Didn't want to put this down, but I felt I needed to because the age in which I lived was forgetting, and therefore I needed to write this down. But the Sefer HaAgur, what does it say? I'll read from line 39. Again, you feel the Marshal's his scorn and derision in relation to those new jumped up Jews who are reading Kabbalistic books and suddenly deciding that they need to change traditional halakhic practice. Hello, Ha'agur, don't think that this is new. Ha'agur nami katav shematzah dinim ba'zohar. The Agur, by the way, is the first halakhic book to include Kabbalistic practices. Okay? And this is one of them, this sitting down for the Shal Yad and the Shal Rosh. As I said, it was used by the Ramah, and the Marshal and the Ramah were great mates, the great friends. So, but this particular din never took on. The Agur, Rabbi Landau, knew his halakha. So he says, look, I found this in the Zohar, but it's nowhere else. Now the Marshal tells his friend, open your eyes and see. If there was any basis for this law, it would have been mentioned by other authors. It's in none of the classical halakhic works. Kivna Karo Shevi Arbeit Varim Azor, and Rabbi Yochanan himself, Veze Loevi, didn't cite this rule. Kilo Kashlaze. Now, what does the Zohar actually say? So this is all very interesting. For aficionados of the Zohar, we'll try this again. Lebatar b'shata the barnash a'al be'kenishta. All right, when you go to the Bet Knesset, the Zohar has a lot to say. You have to prepare yourself, of course, and he tells you exactly which sfirot you're going to influence by the different psukei, the Zimra and the Kavanot and the Korbanot. Tzlota dimiyusha l'kabil tfilah shel yad, and lebatar tzlota dimumad. Then he says prayer consists of two parts. It has to be a prayer act and a prayer speech. And the act has to precede the speech. So you have to do the act of the shel yad, and the yad, of course, the hand is act, before the tefillin shel rosh, because the rosh, your intellect, is ruach the milalaya. That's your ability to speak. That's the intellect. You have to get the order right. Tehila kabal tefillah dereisha, and that corresponds to the tefillin shel rosh. V'da kegavna deda, and the one corresponds to the other. Uvda kegavna didibura, act and speech. V'adai b'uvda milula taliat saluta, that's the essence of prayer. V'pagim uvda milula la ishkach atar desharye be. If you mess this up, then your prayer is totally useless, and it may in fact be negative. V'lav ihu tsaluta, it's not a prayer. V'itpagim ahu barnash la'ela v'tata, and you have destroyed both this world and the upper world. You've got it wrong. And this was the charm, if you like, of the Zohar, the danger of the Zohar. Unless you get it right, you can mess things up because you have the power. We talked about the theurgy of the Zohar, the feeling people had that they could do things and say things that would in fact make a difference. Lord, ela dabaina la chaza uvda ulamala la milula ale v'da hu tzluta shalim. That is a perfect prayer when you get the shel yad, sitting down, because that's the act. It's this worldly type of sitting. It's a physical act, and then you stand up. The upper world, which symbolizes speech. Vai leila barnash, woe to the man, the pagim tzlutei, who damages his prayer. Pulchana damare, the service of the Most High. Alek tiv from Yeshayahu, ki tavo lirot panai, when you come to see my face, I reject you. Gam ki tarbut tefillah eneni shomea. Yeshayahu says, I hate the fact that you're offering sacrifices and you are unjust and you are fraudulent and you are persecuting people. But the Zohar, of course, turns the pasuk to a different effect, and that is if you don't get the mystical structure of your mitzvah acts right, then you're in deep trouble, and you've brought the entire world, both lower and upper, into deep trouble with you. So there's a lot to say about that. We'll just say a little bit in the commentaries we're going to read. But the Sefer HaAgur, this is the passage that the Sefer HaAgur has in mind. And what does he say? He says, Avi, can I get you to read, please, from line 13, the Sefer HaAgur. Nimsa'u dinim.
Nimsa'u dinim b'Zohar b'inyan tefillin, ma she'ena nimtzet b'chol ha'poskim ha'nimtza'im b'yameinu. Shetzarich she'yilbash tefillin shel yad v'yushav b'sorosh mu'umad.
Okay, so what does he say here?
That there are things in the Zohar that we don't find elsewhere. For instance,
New things.
new
Right.
things.
Yeah.
That you put on tefillin shel yad sitting and shalosh.
And then read the next phrase.
Yesh tam gadol ma'od b'Kabbalah.
And there's a great reason for doing this. In other words, this is the first Ashkenazi halachic work, Germany, Landau, in which a halachist actually cites the Zohar and recommends the Zohar. But at the same time, he admits and he feels uncomfortable with the fact there's no precedent, okay? So this is a bit of a bind. And the Marshal then proceeds. Brian, could you please take this on? 16, Marshal proceeds.
Marshal proceeds to reject the entire line of Kabbalistic thought that seeks to divide the mitzvah tefillin into two principles, one symbolized by the hand tefillin and the other by the head tefillin. In his view, it is one mitzvah only, and any other approach that seeks to divide risks leading people to heresy, especially those who are not sufficiently adept in the mystical tradition.
And now we get back to this, to the charge that most people don't understand the Zohar or the Kabbalah. They haven't plumbed its depths, and they're making mistakes, and they're likely to be led astray. Heresy, we think of Shabtai Tzvi, Yaakov Frank, and all the other heretics at the time, okay? ועוד דע שכוונת רשב"י לחלק תפילין של יד ושל ראש וכאלו הן בנויים על שתי יסודות של תפילין של. So he mentions and he says that this is a bit similar to the Zohar statement about person putting in tefillin chol hamoed who's chayav mita. It's also tied up with the fact that the tefillin shel yad and shel rosh, Shabbat and Yom Tov and chol hamoed says v'alachnu ein choshishin lazeh. Marshall rejects all of this. Both tefillin are one thing. The binding is one thing. One is the head and one is the hand, because the Torah says, and you should put the kshartam laot al yadecha. It's as simple as that. If you want to, mitzvot involve action and intellect, but they're not to be separated. The thing about the Zohar that the Marshal doesn't like, and about all Kabbalah, is the separation, because that smacks of heresy. Then it's like dualism. The God of good, the God of bad, the left and the right, the male and the female. Where did all this come from, says the Marshal? You know where it came from? Non-Jewish sources. Or remember that phrase, the kitzutz banetiyot, occurs in Chagiga Yudalad in relation to Elisha ben Abuya when he and his colleagues went down to the Pardes. Or Misha Balidrosh Yidrosh. You want to make a nice drasha, aval be'emet ha'emet yoreh darko. That's not the truth. And if you don't really think about this in sufficient depth, you'll become a heretic. Robert Vassell, Marshall cites the Kolbo.
Marshall, you got me. Marshall cites the Kolbo to the effect that all holy rituals need to be performed standing, and it would be disrespectful to sit.
Okay, so that's where, I'll give you the gist and you can continue, Robert, reading in English. And he says that it's a davar shebikdusha, we should stand up. And this is, in fact, then he uses the Zohar and turns it on its side, on its back, and says the Zohar itself talks about the fact that the tefillin are a chotam, a seal of God. Okay, so when you receive God's seal, you should definitely be standing up. And he cites a pasuk in Shir Hashem, kechotam al zvro'o. And this is God's seal. How dare you sit down in the presence of God's seal? Robert, the answer to the question, therefore.
The answer to the question, therefore, is that it is best to ignore these new mystical trends which their purveyors barely understand. Indeed, they do not even know the revealed Torah, how much more its mystical side.
This is rabbinic aristocracy coming in its classical form. You don't understand anything. You put on the garb, you utter the words, you pretend, but you don't even know Shas and Poskim. You don't know the basic bread and butter, okay? And you've just taken a shortcut. He adds a tradition.
He has a tradition that the medieval French Talmudist and posek Rav Shimshon of Chinon, author of Sefer Kritud and an adept Kabbalist, choose to pray without any mystical input at all, but as a simple child.
And that's a theme that's harped on, as we'll see, in the Mishnah Brura and in others. Also,
he has it on good authority that Israel Isserlein, the author of the Responsa Trumat Hadeshin and a major authority on Ashkenazi halacha, donned his tefillin in a standing position. Marshall concludes with the words of the Mishnah Bava Metzia that the party seeks to change is always at a disadvantage.
It's about a contract in the Mishnah. It's nothing to do with this. You know, if you want to change terms of contract, then, you know, you're going to be at a disadvantage. But that's a great phrase if you want to attack people who are innovating. Deb, would you like to read from line 4 and conclude?
לכן אהובי, אל תלך בדרך איתם.
You remember that from
Yeah.
Mishlei?
כן.
Okay, it says, Al Bani, son, my
בני
son, do
בני
not
אל
go in their
תלך
ways.
בדרך איתם.
Menar raglecha min
עצור
netivotam,
אותך,
and keep your
כן.
foot from going in their path. In other words,
ולשונך מרחם.
they're going to lead you astray. ואין לך עסק.
העסק בנסתרות המתייהרים בחידושים כאילו הם יודעים ומבינים רז תורה ופניה, והלוואי שידעו הגלויים.
In other words, it would be wonderful if you even knew what was non-mystical. People simply make a reach from nothing or almost nothing. Suddenly they're mystics and they're doing wonderfully spiritual things. Marshall has nothing but contempt for these type of people. מה יפה
כוח של רבי שמשון מקינון, אחר שלמד סתרי הקבלה, אמר שהוא מתפלל כתינוק בן יומו.
ודי להבין, all the Kabbalah, if you open a Sephardi Siddur, you'll see all these letters and names of God in different kavanot. Pray like a simple child before your Father in heaven. עוד אומר
לך שקיבלתי מחמי הגדול
הראינו הרב רבי קלונימוס,
זיכרונו לברכה, שקיבל מהחסיד הגדול,
הראינו הרב רבי דניאל ז"ל,
שהיה תלמיד מובהק ושימש מהרבנו ישראל, בעל תרומת הדשן, ז"ל, וראה הנהגתו שנהג כמו שאנו נוהגים. נהוג כדרכך, יהיה להם מה שלהם.
And leave them to do their stuff, אבל דע
שכל המשנה ידו על התחתונה, וידנו לעליונה.
Because we are not trying to be Mishane. Now let's have a look at, sum this up in Mishnah Brura, have a look at some of the Kabbalah and the in Sephardic Jewry, and then we will look at the Nodab Yudah, which is very interesting about the Shem Yichud next time, and see what else we're going to do. Line 11, Shulchan Aruch in Ilchot Tefillin says as follows: Acharei shekashar shel yad al zrua yaniach shel rosh. Rabbi Yosef Karo in the Shulchan Aruch does not mention the sitting down and the standing up. Not in the Shulchan Aruch. ויש מי שאומר שאסור להוציא תפילה של ראש מהתיק עד שתהיה תפילה של יד מונחת. What he does say is that you shouldn't touch your tefillin bag before you touch your talis bag, because there's a rule, ein ma'avirin al hamitzvot, and if you touch your talit before you put on your tefillin, touch your tefillin before you put on your talit, you'll have to put on the tefillin first. Haga, the Ramah says, ואף אם שניהם לפניו חוץ לתיק, לא יתקן לפתוח התפילה של ראש עד אחר הנחה של יד. That's just for your general information. You don't pass over mitzvot. So if the tefillin comes before the talit, you might have to put on the tefillin first. יש מי שכתב להניח של יד מיושב. Now he mentions our point. There are some who say, put on the tefillin של yad sitting, ושל ראש מועמד, he cites the agur, בשם הזוהר, סימן פי ד', ובמדינות אלו לא נהגו כן, but in our countries, the Ramah, Ashkenaz, we don't do that, אלא שתיהן מועמד. משנה ברורה, שתיהן מועמד, ein b'Magen Avraham. Now the Magen Avraham, Rabbi Avram Abeli Gumbinir from Kalish in Poland, 18th century, he wanted to introduce the Sephardic custom into Ashkenaz. And the Hasidim, in fact, some of them do it. שרוצה להכריע עד ההנחה של יד תהיה מיושב, הברכה תהיה בעמידה. אבל באליהו רבא בשם רש"ל, but he cites the Marshal, of course, who wrote in תשובה סימן ס"ח, מי לנו גדול מהראש קינון, who is greater than Rabbi Shimshon of Kinon, who learned Kabbalah and would follow simple, pray like a simple child, and דמישהו יכול להשיג סודה, נכון יבוא לקצץ בנטיות על כאן. So the Marshal had a strong influence on this point. יהיה הברכה והנחה בעמידה. ובביאור הגר"א, the Gra, by the way, also opposed this, הוכיח גם לפי הזוהר, מותר להניח התפילין של יד בעמידה. על כן אין לזוז מהמנהג. But Sephardic Jewry permeated with the Zohar and Kabbalah. What do we read from the Shelot Tshuvot of Rabbi Menachem Azaria Mifano? Menachem Azaria Mifano, as we all know, or not, was a famous Italian rabbi indeed. And the Ra Mifano, well, family came from Fano. He was in Manitoba. He was a Rosh Yeshiva. He was a Rav. His Talmud was Rabbi Brechia, wrote the Mavraya book on the laws of Abelut. It's full of Kabbalah. He says, Gam harav Shlomo Diluria. Now, this is the opposition. Rabbi Shlomo Diluria Ashir Hayaberat. He was rich in knowledge, no denying the greatness of the Marshal. Sheken Yafutsu Mayanotav, and his works have spread all over. Avar b'tshuvotav siman sechet, siftotav dovrot atak. But that tshuva in siman sadichet, that's a real bad one. Bidrushim alalu begava uvabuz. He relates to the learnings of the Zohar arrogantly and disrespectfully. Vadai haya ani botashah. That aniyut dikdukim, of course, he uses like a boomerang against the Marshal. He says he was the ani at the time, okay? Bereft of knowledge. V'chol dvarav shamei hevel echad. All those words are one vanity. Ki avru torat ha'iyun, heferu torat hamusar. They're immoral and they are intellectually unsound. We shouldn't have been reading this tshuva. A truly wise Jew would never read this, and he would tear the tshuva out of the volume of tshuvot so that nobody would be infected by the poison of the Marshal. Okay, I think we're going to have to stop because we've come to time, and I'm going to stop the share. I think there's one thing I want to say is that, which I didn't, but we'll continue with this and have a look at the opposition of the Kabbalists and the Sephardim to the approach of the Marshal. And we locate ourselves perhaps on this axis, okay? Because there were movements back and forth. But what's interesting is if we go back to the subject of tefillin on Chol HaMoed, Ashkenaz generally did lay tefillin on Chol HaMoed, but there were all sorts of compromises made after the Zohar came on the scene. One compromise would be, as we read, to say the brachot quietly. Another compromise, Jean, I don't know whether you heard this, was not to say the brachot on the tefillin at all. Or
to put tefillin without contents.
Or to use posel tefillin. To actually use posel tefillin that you couldn't make a bracha over. Now, why did people go to these extents? Because there was a general minhag in Ashkenaz to put. They were very taken with the Zohar, and the Zohar says you're chayav mitah. So they found ways to get around. They didn't want to look as if they were not putting on tefillin. Okay, so for a few decades, the ways were found around, but eventually the whole thing erupted. You had a famous Rabbi Emanuel Ricci in Italy, who said, I don't care about communal unity. I care about my fate of my soul in the world to come. If it's never going to get to paradise, because I wore tefillin on Chol HaMoed, then I'm really up the creek without a paddle. So I'm going to not wear tefillin, even though the rabbi and the whole shul are wearing tefillin. And this caused the Pachad Yitzchak, Rabbi Yitzchak Lampronti, in his Pachad Yitzchak, has pages on this issue of tefillin, yes or no, because Italy was caught between Sfarad on the one hand and Ashkenaz on the other hand. So they got mixed up and they never knew what to do, and they were always at odds with each other. It's like families, in Melbourne, one ate Chabad Shkita and one ate the Adas Shkita, so they could never eat with each other. Same thing with those who wore tefillin. We Jews take our religion very seriously. We take our book learnings seriously. And if the Zohar says something, well, then, we might be. Eventually, the rabbis gave up the ghost. And in Ashkenaz, unity was no longer the deciding factor. And some people in shul would put on tefillin Jean, I don't know whether you saw this mixed type of practice, and some would not. Some did say a bracha, and some didn't.
That
So
was in Melbourne.
in Melbourne, same
Yes,
thing,
when I
right?
was a kid. When I was a kid in Melbourne,
Yeah, okay.
half the shul did, half the shul didn't.
Right, exactly. So by that time, we'd all got used to that, especially when the Hasidim took on this practice. So, what are you going to do? But there's a lot of fluidity here, and we'll talk about the Kabbalists. By the way, and the other thing I want to tell you is that Ramah Fano, Ramachim Azari Fano, was a very famous Rav and Rosh Yeshiva. His Tshuvot, why he was widely cited. He was a very adept Kabbalist, very famous. He had a Talmud. He had a Talmud called Harav Be'er. He wrote a book, a very fine book. But he mentions that the Ramah Mifano had no beard. And this went ballistic. I was a generation after the Mekubalim said, how can you not have a beard? Kabbalistically speaking, Jewish male has to have a beard, okay? And there's a lot of discussion. The Khatam Sofer wrote something very interesting in his Shuvot in Yoredea Kufnun Tet, I think. He said, well, in Chutz La'aretz, even according to the Kabbalah, you might need to be makpid on a beard. But in Eretz Israel, which is very holy, then of course, had Rafano come to Israel, he would have grown his beard. But the Pulmus HaZaken, and they produced all sorts of pamphlets back and forth, all about the Ramah. He did have a beard, he didn't have a beard. We remember the portrait of Moshe Chefetz, Harav Moshe Chefetz, famous author of Melechet Machshevet. Not only did he not have a beard, he didn't have a kippah either. Anyhow, that's it for this evening, folks. We will continue those Italian rabbis. Shmuley.
Yeah, if the Mahashar says, as he does, that it's both the Shel Yad and the Shel Rosh are one mitzvah, why do we make two brachas?
Well, he says it's one kavanah. It's not a different theological idea. The theology is one, unity in tefillin. There's a machloket in the Gemara in Masechet Menachot about whether technically, halachically, they are two mitzvot. So can you make a bracha if you only have one? And because it's a machloket, how do we resolve it? When we say, I don't know whether you say, but when I say the second bracha on the Shel Rosh, on the Tefillin, I immediately say what? Baruch Shem Olam Va'ed, because it might be a bracha levatala. So I hedge my bets. But this is a halachic issue. And what the Marshal is saying, and this is what we'll hear the Nodab Yudah and the Gaon of Vilna say, you don't understand the mysticism, and it is debatable whether the theology, whether the ideology is two different things. It's tempting to divide, but theologically speaking, when we think about tefillin, we should unify the ideas of hand and heart, okay? But just a nice drasha is, why do we which tefillin do we put on first?
Shel Yad.
And which tefillin do we take off first?
Shel Rosh.
Right. In other words, when you're confronted with one unified mitzvah, first of all, you do it, and then you think whether you can, whether you have the time, whether you can afford it. But if you're going to stop doing the mitzvah, like taking the tefillin off, then you have to think carefully, should I stop doing the mitzvah before you actually take the Shel Yad and you stop doing the mitzvah? But anyhow, all of this...
Is there any other mitzvah you make two brachas on?
That's Shmuley. There is any other mitzvah we make two brachot on, whether there is a safek, a sheila about that. Is it raised in the Gemara? Well, I mean, we do have all sorts of situations, like when you make a borei pri adama on your karpas at the Seder, are you covering? There are those who say you would need to make another bracha on the maror, because you've separated it, okay? So they say, well, you'll get around that by having the kavanah when you make the borei pri adama. But if you didn't have that kavanah, you probably would have to make a bracha.
But,
So
but there's no other mitzvah. You make two separate brachos.
there is no well-known mitzvah.
But it's only Ashkenazim who make two
Yeah,
brachot.
exactly.
Rambam, only
I'm only
he
talking
speaks
about Jewish
together.
people.
Yeah,
Conservatives don't do it.
a mitzvah midoraita. I can't think of something that we'd have to, but mitzvot are not separated. I accept the point, and in fact, it's moot. So you could argue with the Marshal. You could say, you know, I actually in Jewish learning, we can argue with Abaye and Rav Papa, and they died a long time ago. We can even argue with some Rosh Yeshiva who are no longer. We're arguing all the time, and time is irrelevant. When we start learning, then we go from the present to the past, and we go to the future. We can argue with whoever's going to come. Eliyahu Hanavi is going to come. We'll argue with him now. Okay.
Ramchal, I think, had no bad also.
Exactly, the Ramchal, but he didn't get attacked for it. He got attacked for other things. Remember, his Kabbalistic writings were confiscated, locked up in a safe in Venice. He took an oath not to, and then he broke the oath and he went to Amsterdam. They persecuted him there. All these guys, you know, they were characters. We think Ramchal, Mesilat Yesharim. Sorry, that was that. Yeah, sure, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Lutzato. So from, not at all, okay? Shovavnikim, anyhow. And on that, and on that note, we'll say have a very good evening. Next week, continue with the Marshal, and then eventually we'll get to the Ramah and the case of the orphaned bride, and some very interesting stuff there. Okay, that's it. Bye.
Good evening.
Thank you.